Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly beneath a copper sunset, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose that seemed to whisper promises of tomorrow. Josephine Harper stood on her small porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her worn apron, watching the last rays of daylight disappear behind the distant mountains she had grown to love. Over the past 3 years, she had come west as a mail-order bride, but the man who had sent for her died of fever 2 weeks before her arrival in the small town of Copper Springs, left with nothing but her trunk of belongings and a return ticket she refused to use. Josephine had built a life from determination and desperation. Now, at 27, she ran the only boarding house in town, a modest 2-story structure with 6 rooms she kept immaculately clean and comfortable. She cooked 3 meals a day, washed linens until her hands cracked, and listened to the stories of travelers passing through on their way to somewhere else. Her neighbor to the east was a ranch called Broken Creek, owned by a man named Samuel Thornton, who rarely came to town, and even more rarely spoke when he did. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a silence that seemed to carry the weight of unspeakable sorrows. The townspeople whispered that his wife had died 5 years ago, that he had never recovered, that he would work himself into an early grave trying to forget. Josephine saw him sometimes, riding past on his gray mare, his hat pulled low against the sun. He would nod in her direction, a gesture so brief she sometimes wondered if she had imagined it. She had never exchanged more than a dozen words with him in all her time in Copper Springs. That changed the night of the great storm. The thunder had been rolling across the valley for hours when the pounding came at her door. Josephine pulled her shawl tight around her nightgown and opened it to find old Ruth Hawkins, the widow who lived at the edge of town, drenched and trembling. "It's Samuel Thornton," Ruth gasped, rain streaming down her weathered face. "His horse threw him near my property. He's hurt bad, Josephine. I can't lift him. And the doctor is 3 days' ride at the Morrison Ranch delivering a baby. You're the only one who knows healing." Josephine did not hesitate. She grabbed her medicine basket, the one she had inherited from her grandmother, who had taught her the old ways of herbs and poultices, and followed Ruth into the violent night. They found Samuel lying in the mud beside the road, his leg twisted at an angle that made Josephine's stomach clench. But it was the gash on his head that worried her most, bleeding freely into the rain-soaked earth. Between the 2 women, they managed to get him into Ruth's wagon and transport him back to the boarding house. For 3 days, Josephine did not leave his bedside. She set his broken leg with splints she fashioned from barrel staves, stitched the wound on his head with the finest thread she owned, and fought the fever that threatened to claim him with cool compresses and willow bark tea. She barely slept, keeping constant vigil in the rocking chair beside the bed, praying to a God she hoped was listening. On the 4th morning, his eyes opened. His voice was rough as sandpaper, cracked from disuse and thirst. "You're safe," Josephine said softly, leaning forward to press a cup of water to his lips. "You're at my boarding house. You were injured in the storm." He drank deeply, then studied her face with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You saved me. Ruth Hawkins found you. I just did what anyone would do." "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. "Not anyone. You." Samuel Thornton stayed in that bed for 3 weeks while his leg healed. In that time, Josephine learned more about him than the entire town had discovered in 5 years. She learned that his wife, Elizabeth, had died giving birth to a son who followed her into the next world mere hours later. She learned that he had built Broken Creek with his own hands, dreaming of filling it with the sound of children's laughter, a dream that had died alongside his family. She learned that he could not read, a secret shame he had carried his entire life, and that he spent his evenings pretending to study the newspaper because he was too proud to admit the truth. She learned that his favorite color was blue, the blue of wildflowers in spring, because it had been Elizabeth's favorite too. And slowly, carefully, she began to teach him his letters, It started simply enough. Josephine would sit beside his bed in the evenings, after her other boarders had retired, and trace words onto his palm with her fingertip. A, B, C. She felt the calluses on his hands, the roughness earned from years of honest labor, and tried to ignore the way her heart raced at the contact. "You're patient," he observed one night, watching her face in the lamplight. "Most folks would have given up on a grown man who can't spell his own name. Most folks don't understand that learning has no age limit," she replied, tracing the word hope onto his weathered skin. "My grandmother couldn't read until she was 62 years old. She said it was the greatest gift she ever gave herself." Samuel caught her hand before she could pull away, holding it gently in his larger one. "Why aren't you married, Josephine Harper?" The question struck her like a physical blow. She tried to withdraw her hand, but he held firm, waiting for an answer with those impossibly patient eyes. "I was supposed to be," she finally admitted. "That's why I came west. But Thomas Blackwood died before I arrived, and I decided to stay anyway. To build something of my own." "That's not what I asked." His thumb said circles on her wrist, directly over her pulse, which she was certain he could feel racing. "I asked why you aren't married now. You're young, you're beautiful. You're kind in ways this territory has almost forgotten. Half the men in town would marry you tomorrow if you gave them the slightest encouragement." Josephine felt heat flood her cheeks. "I suppose I'm still waiting." "For what?" "For something real," she whispered. "For someone who sees me. Not just a boarding house owner who can cook and clean, but me. The woman who reads poetry when she thinks no one is watching. The woman who talks to the stars because she's lonely. The woman who is terrified every single day that she made the wrong choice by staying, but who is more terrified of leaving." Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then, so gently she almost missed the motion, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I see you, Josephine." She fled the room that night, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat on her porch and watched the stars wheel overhead, wondering if the universe was finally answering a prayer she had been too afraid to voice. The next morning, Ruth Hawkins came to call. The old widow found Josephine in the kitchen, kneading bread with more force than necessary, trying to work out the confusion that had kept her awake all night. Ruth settled into a chair with a knowing smile that made Josephine deeply suspicious. "I hear our patient is making a fine recovery," Ruth said casually, accepting the cup of coffee Josephine offered. "The whole town is talking about how well you've cared for him. Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have, and you know it." Ruth's sharp eyes missed nothing. "That man has been dead inside for 5 years, Josephine. Dead and buried alongside his wife and son. But these past weeks, something has changed. I see it in his face when he looks toward your boarding house. I see it in the way he asks about you when folks stop by to check on him." Josephine's hands stilled in the dough. "Ruth, you seem to be good in bed," Ruth continued, and Josephine felt her face flame crimson. "Are you married, Ruth?" Josephine gasped, scandalized. The old woman cackled, clearly delighted by her reaction. "Good in bed, girl, meaning you know how to care for someone who is confined to one. You've got healing hands and a healing heart. It's a gift, what you did for Samuel Thornton. Most folks would have let him suffer through that fever. You sat with him day and night, fought death himself for a man who was practically a stranger. That takes something special." Josephine slowly resumed her kneading, her heart still racing from the misunderstanding. "He's not a stranger anymore." "No," Ruth agreed, her voice softening. "I don't suppose he is. So I'll ask you again, properly this time. Are you married, Josephine Harper?" "No." Josephine felt the tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "I'm still waiting." "Well, maybe it's time to stop waiting and start living." Ruth rose, pressing a papery kiss to Josephine's cheek. "That man loves you, child, even if he doesn't know it yet. And I suspect you love him too. Don't let fear steal what the universe is trying to give you." A week later, Samuel Thornton was well enough to leave. Josephine watched him gather his few belongings, her heart breaking with every movement he made. She had become accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice in the evenings as he practiced his letters, to the way he said her name like it was something precious. "I can't pay you what this is worth," he said, standing in the doorway of the room that had become his sanctuary. "What you did for me, what you gave me, there's no price for that. I don't want payment, Samuel." "I know." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him, soap and leather, and something uniquely his. "But I need to give you something. I need you to know what these weeks have meant to me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn and creased as if he had handled it many times. When Josephine unfolded it, she found her own name written in shaky, uneven letters below it. In handwriting that improved with each line was a message. "Josephine, you are my sunrise. You are my reason. I was dead, and you brought me back. I will love you until the stars fall." She looked up at him through tears, unable to speak. "It's the first thing I ever wrote," he said hoarsely. "Took me 4 nights to get it right. I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to know, Samuel. I know I'm not much," he continued, the word tumbling out as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I'm a rancher who can barely raid. I'm a widower with ghosts I'll carry forever. I'm older than you deserve, rougher than you need, poorer than you warrant. But I love you, Josephine Harper. I love you in a way I didn't think I was capable of anymore. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my days proving it." Josephine launched herself into his arms. He caught her easily, despite his healing leg, and held her like she was the most precious thing in the territory. When his lips finally found hers, it was like coming home to a place she had never known she was searching for. The kiss was tender and fierce all at once, full of promises and healing and hope. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I've loved you since you opened your eyes and looked at me like I was the only person in the world." "You were," he said simply. "You are." They were married 3 months later, on a spring morning when the wildflower painted the desert in shades of blue that would have made Elizabeth smile. Ruth Hawkins stood as witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and claiming allergies. Half the town turned out, surprised and delighted by the union of the quiet era and chair and the boarding house owner who had become the heart of their community. Josephine moved to Broken Creek, but she kept the boarding house, hiring a young widow named Margaret to run it in her absence. She could not bear to let go of the place where her life had truly begun, where she had found purpose and ultimate love. Samuel continued his reading lessons, and within a year he was devouring every book Josephine could find. She would catch him sometimes, sitting by the fire with a novel in his hands, his lips moving silently as he traced the words, and her heart would swell with a love so vast it frightened her. "What are you looking at?" he asked one evening, catching her staring. "My husband," she replied, settling onto his lap and wrapping her arms around his neck. "My sunrise, my reason," he laughed, a sound she had come to treasure more than gold. "You read my letter again." "I read it every day. It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "Then I'll write you another one tomorrow. And the day after that, I'll write you letters until we're old and gray and can't remember our own names. And even then, I'll write your name, Josephine, because that's the one word I will never forget." 2 years later, their daughter was born on a night when the stars seemed to shine brighter than ever before. They named her Hope, because that was what Josephine had traced onto Samuel's palm the night their love story truly began. Ruth Hawkins held the baby on the porch of Broken Creek Ranch, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "You know," she said to Samuel, who stood beside her with an expression of wonderment he had never thought he would wear again, "I told your wife she seemed good in bed." Asked if she was married. Samuel looked at the old woman with confusion. She said no, she was still waiting. Ruth smiled at the baby in her arms, at the man who had healed, at the woman visible through the window resting peacefully in a bed filled with love. "Seems like the waiting is finally over." Samuel gazed through the window at his wife, at the future he had never dared to imagine, at the light that had bloomed from tragedy like wildflowers from ashes. "It was worth the wait," he said softly. "Every moment, every heartbreak, every year of loneliness. It all led me here. It all led me to her. And as the Arizona sunrise painted the desert in shades of gold and rose, Samuel Thornton understood that love was not about forgetting the past. It was about having the courage to embrace the future, one handwritten letter at a time.